Victoria Bennett didn't stumble. CEOs don't stumble. They stride, they command, they conquer. But tonight, as Chicago's elite toasted her latest billion-dollar merger, her champagne glass tilted just slightly too far. Her Louboutin caught on marble she'd walked 1,000 times. And for one terrible moment, the most powerful woman in the room nearly fell. Everyone saw. No one moved. Except Marcus Hayes, the quiet man by the water station, the single father who'd buried his wife because of someone else's drunken decision, who knew exactly what happened when people looked away from things that mattered. The grand ballroom of the Millennium Tower never failed to impress. Crystal chandeliers the size of compact cars hung from vaulted ceilings, casting prismatic light across 500 of Chicago's most influential people. Marble floors gleamed like still water, reflecting designer gowns and custom tuxedos that cost more than most people's annual salaries. At the center of it all, commanding attention without demanding it, stood Victoria Bennett. At 36, Victoria had built Bennett Industries from a modest inheritance into a multi-billion-dollar empire spanning technology, real estate, and venture capital. Tonight's gala celebrated her latest acquisition, a struggling manufacturing company she'd transformed into a profitable enterprise while saving 800 jobs. The press loved the narrative, the ice queen with a heart. Her competitors knew better. Victoria Bennett didn't make moves based on sentiment. She made moves that won. Her gown was the color of arterial blood, custom Valentino that hugged every calculated curve before flowing behind her like liquid fire. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant twist that showcased diamond earrings worth more than a house. She moved through the crowd like a comet, trailing conversations and carefully managed laughter. CEOs straightened their spines when she approached. Board members rehearsed their pitches. Everyone wanted a moment of her time, a fraction of her attention, a sliver of her approval. Everyone except Marcus Hayes. He stood near the beverage station at the room's edge, nursing his third glass of water and checking his watch for the 4th time in 10 minutes. The tuxedo he wore was rented, though he'd been careful to choose one that fit well enough not to broadcast that fact. His shoes were his own, good leather, well-maintained, but not the Italian craftsmanship that surrounded him. At 32, Marcus had the kind of face people forgot 5 minutes after meeting him. Pleasant, unremarkable, the kind of quiet competence that blended into backgrounds at events like this. He preferred it that way. A colleague materialized at his elbow, bow tie loosened, working on what appeared to be his 5th cocktail. The man swayed slightly, gesturing at the open bar with enthusiasm that bordered on evangelical. Marcus shook his head, offering a small smile. His colleague clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to slosh water, making a comment about wasting opportunities, about how often guys like them got invited to something like this. Never, Marcus thought. We get invited never. We get obligated. The truth was more complicated. Bennett Industries employed over 3,000 people across its various holdings. The annual gala was mandatory for senior leadership and strongly encouraged for select high performers from each division. Marcus's inclusion had nothing to do with his personality, and everything to do with the algorithm he'd developed that had saved the company approximately $14 million in operational inefficiencies over the past fiscal year. He'd been given a gold-embossed invitation, a rental tuxedo allowance, and the clear expectation that he'd show his face, smile appropriately, and demonstrate gratitude for the opportunity to breathe the same air as the executive class. Declining wasn't technically impossible, but it was the kind of career-limiting decision that a single father couldn't afford to make. So Marcus had arranged for his sister-in-law Lisa to stay with his daughter Emma, had put on the uncomfortable shoes and even more uncomfortable smile, and had shown up to play his part in Victoria Bennett's carefully orchestrated theater of success. He checked his watch again. 9:47. He'd promised Emma he'd be home by midnight to check on her, even though she insisted she was practically a teenager at 11 years old and didn't need checking on. The memory of her eye roll made him smile genuinely for the first time all evening. A woman's voice cut through his thoughts, polite but carrying the subtle edge of someone used to being heard the first time. Marcus stepped aside automatically, making room at the beverage station, already forming an apology he didn't finish when he realized who stood less than 3 feet away. Victoria Bennett, up close, was somehow both more and less than her public image. The photos didn't capture the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes, but they also didn't show the fine lines of exhaustion at their corners, or the way her smile looked like something she'd practiced until it became automatic. She reached past him for a glass, her hand steady as she filled it from the pitcher. Ice cubes clinked softly against crystal. When she spoke, her voice held recognition that shouldn't have surprised him, but did. Marcus confirmed his identity, adding a respectful address that made her lips quirk slightly, though she didn't correct him. She mentioned his efficiency algorithm, noting that her CFO hadn't stopped talking about it for 3 months. The work was elegant, she said. Remarkable. He had a gift for seeing patterns other people missed. Marcus had no idea how to respond, so he defaulted to appreciation and gratitude, the safe corporate language that kept interactions professional and brief. Victoria studied him for a moment longer than was comfortable, her eyes searching his face for something he couldn't identify. Then she raised her water glass slightly, a tiny salute, and wished him a pleasant evening before gliding back into the crowd. Within seconds, she was absorbed into a cluster of executives competing for her attention. Marcus released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His colleague returned, eyes wide with disbelief, demanding to know what had just happened. An actual conversation with Scarlett Bennett about work, as casually as discussing the weather. The colleague shook his head, muttering about opportunities wasted, about how many men in the room would kill for 5 seconds of her attention. Marcus knew. He could see them circling her like well-dressed sharks, each one angling for position, for advantage, for the chance to be remembered as someone who mattered. Victoria handled them all with practiced grace, her smile never wavering, her posture never relaxing. She was just doing her job, Marcus thought, making people feel valued. Good management. As his colleague wandered off in search of another drink, Marcus found his attention drifting back to Victoria. She'd moved to the center of the ballroom now, surrounded by a new constellation of executives and board members. Someone handed her a champagne flute. She took it with a smile, raised it in a toast to something someone said, and drank. That was her 3rd glass since Marcus had arrived. He'd noticed because he was trained to notice patterns, to see data in the world around him. 3 glasses in just under 2 hours. Not excessive by most standards, especially at an event like this where alcohol flowed as freely as conversation. But there was something about the way she drank. Not savoring, not socializing, but something else that made him pay attention. Maybe he was projecting. Maybe he saw problems where none existed because he'd learned to be hypervigilant about this particular issue. His phone buzzed. Lisa's text came with laughing emojis, asking if he looked stressed in her imagination. He typed back quickly, confirming he was fine, asking about Emma. The response came immediately. Asleep for the last hour, didn't even finish her movie. Lisa was binging reality television and eating his ice cream. Marcus smiled despite himself, corrected her that it was the cheap ice cream, and confirmed he'd see her by midnight. When he looked up, Victoria had moved again. She was near the silent auction tables now, examining a painting with an older gentleman Marcus recognized as the owner of a major Chicago newspaper. Her champagne glass was empty. Someone had already replaced it with a full one. 4th glass. The evening was far from over. The next hour passed in the peculiar slow-motion way of mandatory social events. Marcus made appropriate small talk with people whose names he'd forget by morning. He admired auction items he had no intention of bidding on, a week in Tuscany, courtside Bulls tickets, a vintage wine collection from Napa Valley. He smiled and nodded and checked his watch and reminded himself that this was part of the job, that his presence here mattered in ways he couldn't quantify but understood instinctively. and he watched Victoria Bennett. Not obviously, not in the way others watched her, with hunger or envy or calculation. He watched the way he'd learned to watch for signs of danger, for subtle shifts that indicated when something was going wrong before it became catastrophic. Glass 5 came around 11:15. Glass 6 appeared shortly after. By 11:40, Victoria's movements had changed in ways so subtle that most people wouldn't notice. Her gestures were slightly wider, her laugh slightly louder, her transitions between conversation groups slightly less smooth. She was still in control, still commanding the room, still the center of gravity everyone orbited, but the control was requiring more effort. His colleague returned one final time, significantly more unsteady than before, mentioning something about heading to a bar on Rush Street. The invitation was extended with a vague gesture that could have meant anything. Marcus declined. He had responsibilities. The colleague made a comment about being 23 going on 50, asking when Marcus had last actually gone out. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago. The night before Sarah died. The crash wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to cut through the ambient noise of the ballroom. Near the main doors, Victoria had collided with a waiter carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Glass exploded across marble, liquid spread in golden pools that reflected chandelier light like scattered coins. Victoria's voice carried across the sudden hush, apologizing with the careful precision of someone concentrating very hard on enunciation. She insisted it was entirely her fault, that she wasn't watching where she was going, attempting to help clean the mess. The waiter was already kneeling, gathering shards with practiced efficiency, politely declining her assistance. A security guard materialized, along with a venue manager, and within seconds they'd formed a protective barrier around both the mess and Victoria, ushering people away with apologetic smiles. The crowd absorbed the moment and moved on. Someone made a joke about champagne waterfall art installations. Laughter rippled and faded. The orchestra, which had paused for barely a heartbeat, resumed playing. Everything returned to normal so quickly it was like the incident had never happened. Except Victoria wasn't where she'd been. Marcus scanned the crowd and found her near the coat check, leaning slightly against a marble column, her face turned away from the remaining guests. Her shoulders were rigid with the kind of tension that comes from holding yourself together through sheer force of will. No one approached her. Not the executives who'd been competing for her attention all evening, not the board members who'd hung on her every word, not any of the 500 people who would have crawled across broken glass for a chance at a private moment with Victoria Bennett. They all looked away. Marcus understood the calculus instantly. Acknowledging her moment of weakness, her loss of control, however minor, felt dangerous. In the world these people inhabited, power was absolute, or it was nothing. Showing concern would be acknowledging the crack in the facade, and no one wanted to be the one who noticed when the queen was vulnerable. So they pretended not to see. They continued their conversations and their networking and their careful social dances. And they left Victoria Bennett alone in a room full of people. Marcus's feet were moving before his brain fully processed the decision. He crossed the ballroom with the same unremarkable efficiency he brought to everything, just another forgettable face in the crowd. When he reached her, she was pressing her fingers against her temples, eyes closed. His voice was quiet, giving her the option to ignore him if she wanted, asking if she was all right. Her eyes opened, focusing on him with some difficulty. Recognition flickered across her features, followed by something that might have been relief or resignation. Marcus offered to help her find her driver, keeping his tone neutral and professional. Driver? She repeated the word like it was in a foreign language. She'd sent him home hours ago. She'd thought. Her gesture took in the ballroom behind them, vague and incomplete. Someone would. But everyone, still. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Everyone was still networking, still posturing, still playing the game. And she was the prize they all wanted, but no one wanted to see as human enough to need help. Marcus's offer was simple and direct. Let me drive you home. Victoria studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes trying to focus, trying to assess his motives. Marcus kept his expression neutral, patient. He wasn't angling for anything, wasn't trying to leverage this moment into opportunity. He was just a man who recognized a dangerous situation and couldn't walk away from it. Maybe she saw that. Maybe she was just tired of standing. Either way, she nodded once, accepting his help. Getting Victoria's coat took 3 minutes of polite insistence with a coat check attendant who seemed convinced that Ms. Bennett couldn't possibly be leaving with someone like Marcus. Getting through the ballroom without attracting attention took longer. People kept trying to intercept them, to pull Victoria into one more conversation, one more pitch, one more moment of her time. Victoria deflected each attempt smoothly, her public smile back in place, even as she swayed slightly, citing an early morning commitment and promising to continue discussions on Monday. Marcus kept his hand lightly on her elbow, not guiding, but steadying, ready to catch her if her heels betrayed her again. They made it to the elevators without incident. As the golden doors slid closed, cutting them off from the ballroom's glittering chaos, Victoria sagged against the wall with a soft exhalation. The thank you she offered was quiet and genuine. The elevator descended in silence, punctuated only by the soft ping of passing floors. Marcus watched the numbers count down and tried not to think about how surreal this was. Victoria Bennett, in her blood-red gown, leaning against mirrored walls like any other exhausted person at the end of a long night, and him in his rented tuxedo about to drive the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company home in his 7-year-old Honda Civic. The parking garage was 3 levels below ground, concrete and fluorescent lights that seemed aggressively bright after the ballroom's soft ambiance. Marcus's car looked exactly as he'd expected, embarrassingly ordinary next to the Teslas and BMWs and that one Bentley that probably cost more than he'd earn in a lifetime. He unlocked the passenger door first, holding it open while Victoria gathered her gown and folded herself into the seat with the careful concentration of someone doing something much more complicated than sitting down. Then he circled to the driver's side, started the engine, and pulled out into Chicago's midnight streets. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. Victoria had her eyes closed, head tilted back against the headrest. Marcus focused on driving, on the familiar rhythms of turn signals and traffic lights and the city's late-night pulse. Then Victoria's voice broke the silence, quiet and raw in a way her public voice never was. She wasn't always like this, she said. When she started the company, she worked 18-hour days, lived on coffee and takeout and ambition. She didn't drink, didn't have time for it. Her laugh was bitter, self-aware. Now she had all the time in the world and nothing but champagne to fill it with. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his response careful and measured. She could stop. The champagne. Victoria opened her eyes, turning to look at him with an expression that was equal parts challenge and desperation. Could she? Did he know what happened in her world if you showed weakness? If you admitted you might need help? Board members started questioning your judgment. Competitors smelled blood. You think you can build an empire and then just ask for a timeout? Marcus thought about the waiter on his knees gathering broken glass, the executives who'd looked away, the crowd that had pretended not to notice their queen's moment of vulnerability. His words came slowly, carefully chosen. The people in that ballroom tonight weren't looking away because they respected her strength. They were looking away because they were afraid of her weakness. And she was giving them exactly what they wanted, a reason to doubt her. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, processing. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, some of the defensive edge gone, replaced by genuine curiosity. Why didn't you look away? Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd spent 3 years avoiding this conversation, avoiding even thinking about it in any detail that might crack open the careful compartmentalization that kept him functional. But something about the darkness of the car, the lateness of the hour, the strange intimacy of this moment made the words come easier. His wife died 3 years ago, hit by a drunk driver. 22-year-old kid who'd had too much at a party. His friends saw him get in his car, saw that he was impaired, and they looked away because it was easier than making it their problem. Sarah was driving home from a late shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. She never saw him coming. The silence that followed felt heavy, full of the weight of things that couldn't be unsaid. Victoria's apology was soft and sincere. Marcus made it clear he wasn't sharing to make her feel guilty. He was sharing because he'd learned something that night. Not from losing Sarah, but from what came after. All the people at the funeral who said they'd noticed the warning signs but hadn't wanted to interfere. Her supervisor who'd noticed she was exhausted but hadn't insisted she go home earlier. The kid's friends who'd let him drive because confronting him would have been awkward. Everyone who looked away from something that mattered because acknowledging it was uncomfortable. A red light gave him a moment to organize his thoughts before continuing. He couldn't fix the world, couldn't make people stop drinking, couldn't make everyone's problems his responsibility. But when he saw someone in a position where looking away might lead to harm, to them or to someone else, he couldn't do it. He wouldn't be the person who looked away. Victoria didn't respond immediately. When the light turned green and Marcus accelerated, she finally spoke, her voice rough with emotion she was trying to contain. His daughter. How old? 11. Addison. She's... He paused, searching for words adequate to describe his daughter, and finding them all insufficient. She's everything. Does she know about her mother? She was 8 when it happened. She remembers. Marcus's throat tightened with the familiar ache of this particular grief. She remembers too much and not enough. She remembers Sarah reading to her, making breakfast, singing off-key in the car. But she's losing the details. The exact sound of her voice, the specific way she smiled. And I can see her trying to hold on to those memories, and I can see them slipping away. And there's nothing I can do about it. Victoria's response was quiet but firm. He was doing everything he could, being there for her. That mattered more than he knew. Marcus could only say he hoped so. They drove in silence for another few minutes, the city passing by in strips of light and shadow. Then Victoria gave him her address, a high-rise building on the Gold Coast that Marcus recognized from architectural magazines Emma had shown him. The kind of place where doormen wore uniforms and the lobby had its own art collection. He pulled up to the entrance, put the car in park, and turned to look at Victoria. In the dim light of the car's interior, she looked younger somehow, or maybe just more human. The armor of her public persona had fallen away, leaving someone who was tired and lonely and scared in ways she probably never admitted. Her thank you came again, this time for seeing her, for not looking away. Marcus asked if she'd be all right getting upstairs, genuine concern overriding professional distance. She assured him she'd be fine, already reaching for the door handle. Then she paused, turning back with a question that landed like a small revelation. The water at the beverage station. That was all he'd been drinking tonight. Marcus confirmed it was, because of what happened to his wife, because of what he saw it do to his daughter. The grief was bad enough. He couldn't add his own problems to her burden. His next words came with the weight of a vow, a promise made to himself as much as to Victoria. He hadn't had a drink since the night before Sarah died, not because he was an alcoholic, but because he couldn't trust himself not to become one, couldn't risk Emma losing both parents to the same thing. Victoria nodded slowly, processing this information with visible effort. That's why he'd noticed tonight. Why he'd paid attention when no one else did. Yes. She was quiet for a beat before speaking again, her voice carrying the careful enunciation of someone working hard to articulate clearly. She wasn't an alcoholic either, but it sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. Marcus didn't argue. He simply noted that she was using alcohol to cope with something. And coping wasn't the same as solving. Eventually, the thing you're coping with breaks through anyway, and then you have two problems instead of one. Victoria's question came with a hint of her public humor, the mask slipping back into place for a moment. When did he become so wise? Marcus's answer was honest and unadorned. He wasn't wise. He was just familiar with the cost of looking away. Victoria opened the door and stepped out into the cool night air. The doorman was approaching, his expression carefully neutral despite the hour and the state of his most famous resident. Before closing the door, Victoria leaned back down, her eyes meeting Marcus's with unexpected intensity. Would she see him Monday at the office? Marcus confirmed he'd be there. Good, she said. And then, with something that looked like vulnerability breaking through her usual control, she added one more thing. What he'd done tonight, driving her home, talking to her like a person instead of a position. She wouldn't forget it. Before Marcus could respond, she turned and was walking toward the building entrance with the careful dignity of someone determined not to stumble. The doorman held the door, murmured something respectful, and they both disappeared into the building's golden interior. Marcus sat in his car for a moment longer, hands still on the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. Then he checked the dashboard clock. 12:17, later than he'd promised, but not terribly so, and pulled away from the curb. The drive back to his neighborhood took him from the Gold Coast's pristine streets to more modest surroundings, where buildings were shorter and older, and the cars parked along the curbs were more practical than prestigious. His building was a 3-story walk-up that had probably been nice in the 1940s and was now just clean and affordable. He parked in his assigned spot, climbed the stairs to the second floor, and unlocked his apartment as quietly as possible. Lisa was on the couch, laptop open, some reality show playing on mute. She looked up when he entered, eyebrows rising at the tuxedo. Her question about the fancy party was delivered with friendly curiosity rather than mockery. Long, Marcus said, shrugging out of the jacket. Thanks for staying. Lisa closed her laptop, studying him with a kind of attention that came from knowing someone through their worst moments. She noted that Emma had been perfect, going to bed without protest at 9:30, homework completed. Marcus asked if she'd finished both math and English, falling into the familiar rhythm of parental verification. Lisa confirmed everything was done, then added with a smile that Emma needed new cleats for soccer. Apparently her current ones were tragically outdated, and she'd die of embarrassment if she had to wear them to practice again. Marcus smiled tiredly, making a mental note. He'd take Emma shopping this weekend. Lisa gathered her things, but paused before leaving, her expression shifting to something more serious. Was he okay? He looked like something had happened. Marcus considered how to answer, how to explain that he'd spent the last hour of his evening driving Chicago's most powerful CEO home and having a conversation about loss and loneliness and the ways people learn to cope with both. How to describe the strange moment of connection he'd felt with someone who existed in a completely different world from his. Just a weird night, he finally said. Weird in ways he wasn't ready to articulate yet. Lisa accepted this with a knowing nod, reminding him that if he ever wanted to talk about anything, Sarah, work, life, she was available. Marcus thanked her, meaning it. After Lisa left, he changed out of the tuxedo and into comfortable clothes, moving quietly through his small apartment. He checked on Emma, opening her door just enough to see her curled up under her constellation-patterned comforter, one arm wrapped around the stuffed elephant Sarah had given her for her 5th birthday. Her breathing was deep and even, her face peaceful in sleep. Marcus stood there for a long moment, watching his daughter, and feeling the familiar tightness in his chest that came from loving someone so much it physically hurt. She was everything good that remained from his life with Sarah. Every laugh, every accomplishment, every terrible joke and eye roll and stubborn insistence on independence, it was all proof that something beautiful could survive even the worst tragedy. He closed her door quietly and went to his own room, but sleep felt impossible. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Victoria Bennett in her red gown, about the loneliness in her eyes, about the way everyone had looked away when she stumbled.
He thought about the cost of power and the price of being human in a world that demanded perfection. He thought about coping mechanisms and the stories people told themselves to justify their choices. He thought about his own choice, made 3 years ago in a hospital waiting room while his daughter sobbed in his arms, to never let alcohol become his solution to unbearable pain. And he thought about Monday morning, when he'd returned to his desk and his algorithms and his quiet, unremarkable existence, and Victoria Bennett would return to her corner office and her board meetings and her empire. The strange intimacy of tonight would fade into the normal distance between a CEO and a mid-level employee. Everything would return to how it was supposed to be. Except that wasn't how things worked, Marcus realized, as sleep finally began to pull him under. Patterns, once disrupted, never returned to their exact original form. Something had shifted tonight. Some variable had changed, and he had no algorithm to predict where the new pattern might lead. But he'd learned to trust his instincts about these things, about the subtle shifts that indicated when something fundamental was changing. And his instincts told him that what had happened tonight, the moment when he'd chosen not to look away, was going to matter in ways he couldn't yet see. Outside his window, Chicago continued its endless movement. Millions of individual lives intersecting and diverging in patterns too complex for any algorithm to fully capture. Somewhere in the city, in a penthouse apartment with a view of the lake, Victoria Bennett was probably lying awake as well, thinking about the same moment from a different angle, wondering what it meant that someone had finally seen her not as a position or a prize, but as a person who needed help. The night didn't offer any answers, but sometimes, Marcus had learned, asking the right questions was enough to start changing the pattern. And tomorrow would reveal whether that change was for better or worse. For now, though, there was just this, the quiet apartment, his daughter sleeping safely down the hall, and the strange, uncertain knowledge that he'd done something that mattered, even if he couldn't yet see the full shape of what he'd set in motion. That would have to be enough. Monday morning arrived with a kind of gray drizzle that made Chicago feel like it was wrapped in wet newsprint. Marcus dropped Emma at school. She was still campaigning for new cleats, making increasingly dramatic arguments about her social survival, and drove to the Bennett Industries tower with the radio playing soft jazz that didn't quite mask his nervous energy. He told himself the nervousness was ridiculous. Nothing had changed. He'd helped someone who needed help, had a meaningful conversation, and that was the end of it. Victoria Bennett had probably woken up Sunday morning with a headache and vague embarrassment, had maybe sent a polite thank you email that some assistant had drafted, and had already moved on to the 1,000 other concerns that filled a CEO's calendar. The lobby was its usual Monday chaos, security badges beeping, coffee cups clutched like lifelines, the low hum of people psyching themselves up for another week. Marcus badged in, took the elevator to the 14th floor where data analytics lived in a warren of cubicles and conference rooms, and settled into his desk with the comforting routine of logging in, checking emails, reviewing weekend automated reports. Nothing from Victoria. Of course not. What had he expected? He was 3 emails deep into a thread about database optimization when his desk phone rang. The internal number on the display made his stomach drop. Extension 5000. Executive floor. He stared at it for 2 more rings before answering, his voice carefully neutral. The assistant's voice was professionally pleasant, giving him no time to respond before placing him on hold.
Classical music filled the line. Marcus's mind raced through possibilities, each one more uncomfortable than the last. Maybe she was calling to politely establish boundaries, to make clear that Friday night's vulnerability was an aberration that shouldn't be mentioned again. Maybe she'd reconsidered his comments in the car, decided they were presumptuous. Victoria's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, clear and composed, asking if he had a moment. Marcus confirmed he did, fighting to keep his tone professional. Could he come up to her office? There was something she'd like to discuss. The classical music returned before he could ask what. Marcus set down the phone and stared at his monitor for a solid 10 seconds, trying to calibrate his reaction. Around him, the usual Monday morning sounds continued. Keyboards clicking, someone laughing at a joke, the coffee maker gurgling in the break room. Normal life carrying on, while his own veered into unexpected territory. A colleague rolled his chair over from the adjacent cubicle, eyebrows raised in curiosity. Was that who he thought it was? Marcus confirmed he needed to go upstairs for a minute, already standing. Upstairs? Like executive floor upstairs? The colleague's eyes went wide with speculation Marcus didn't have time to address. He grabbed a notepad out of habit, checked that his badge was visible, and headed for the elevators, trying not to think about what this might mean. The executive floor occupied the entire 42nd story of the tower and was designed to remind visitors that they had ascended to rarefied air. The elevator opened onto a reception area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Modern art that probably cost more than Marcus's annual salary, and a receptionist who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. Marcus gave his name, noting that Ms. Bennett was expecting him. The receptionist smiled with professional warmth that didn't quite reach her eyes, made a brief call, then gestured toward the corridor beyond. Third door on the left. Ms. Bennett's assistant would meet him there. The assistant was a woman in her 50s named Patricia, who Marcus had encountered once before during his initial presentation of the efficiency algorithm. She had the kind of competent energy that suggested she ran half the company, while Victoria ran the other half. Her handshake was firm, her greeting genuinely warm as she led him to a small sitting area outside Victoria's office. Leather chairs, more expensive art, a view that made Chicago look like an architect's model. Patricia returned with water in actual glass and told him Ms. Bennett was just finishing a call. Marcus sipped while trying not to think about the fact that he was sitting outside the CEO's office on a Monday morning for reasons he couldn't begin to guess. The door opened, and a man in an expensive suit emerged, looking pleased with himself. Patricia caught Marcus's eye and nodded toward the open doorway. Victoria's office was exactly what he'd expected, and nothing like it at the same time. Yes, there was the massive desk and the leather chairs and the panoramic windows, but there were also personal touches that surprised him. A small jade plant on the windowsill, a framed photograph of what looked like a much younger Victoria with an older woman, possibly her mother. Books lined one wall, not just business texts, but novels, poetry, philosophy. Victoria stood by the windows, silhouetted against the gray morning light. She'd traded Friday's red gown for a charcoal suit that was somehow both severe and elegant. When she turned to face him, her expression was controlled but not cold. She thanked him for coming up, gesturing to the chairs opposite her desk. Her invitation to sit was delivered with a formality that felt deliberately professional, creating distance that was probably necessary. For a moment, she simply looked at him, and Marcus had the unsettling sense that she was seeing through all his carefully maintained ordinariness to something underneath. Her words, when they came, were not what he'd expected. She owed him an apology. Marcus started to protest, but she held up a hand, asking him to let her finish. Friday night, she'd put him in an uncomfortable position. She was at a company event and wasn't at her best. He felt obligated to help because of the power dynamics between them, and that wasn't fair to him. Marcus's response was careful, but honest. He didn't feel obligated. He offered because he wanted to help. Victoria's counter was gentle but probing. Did he?
Or did he offer because saying no to his CEO would have felt impossible? Marcus considered this carefully, knowing his answer mattered. He offered because he saw someone who needed help, and everyone else was looking away. The fact that she was his CEO made it more complicated, yes, but it didn't change the fundamental situation. Victoria studied him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. In the car, he told her about his wife, about the drunk driver. That couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, Marcus admitted. But it felt important that she understand why he noticed, why he couldn't look away. Her next words came slowly, like she was choosing each one with care. The things he'd said about coping versus solving, about alcohol being a problem she was creating rather than a solution she was finding. She paused, seeming to gather herself.
She'd thought about that conversation quite a bit over the weekend. Marcus waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. And she was right. The admission seemed to cost her something. She'd been drinking more over the past year, not enough to interfere with work, or so she'd told herself, just enough to make the evenings more tolerable, the loneliness less sharp. But Friday night she'd crossed a line she swore she'd never cross. She lost control in public. The sentence hung incomplete between them, weighted with implications neither of them wanted to fully articulate. Victoria continued after a moment, her voice steadier now. She'd spent 3 days thinking about what could have happened, how much worse it could have been. Marcus kept his expression neutral, giving her space to work through whatever she'd come here to say. Her next statement was delivered with the kind of vulnerability that felt like a gift. She'd called him up here to thank him properly, and to tell him she'd made an appointment with someone, a therapist who specialized in executive stress and related issues. Her first session was Wednesday. "That's good," Marcus said, meaning it. "That's really good." Victoria's defensiveness crept back into her voice as she clarified. She wasn't an alcoholic. She wanted to be clear about that. Marcus simply acknowledged her statement, not arguing, not agreeing, just accepting what she needed to believe right now. But she'd been using alcohol in ways that weren't healthy, Victoria continued, and she'd been ignoring that because admitting it felt like admitting weakness. And she couldn't afford. She stopped herself. No, that was the old thinking, the thinking that led to Friday night. Her correction was deliberate, a real-time shift in perspective Marcus could see happening. The truth was that ignoring problems didn't make them go away. It just made them worse. Yes, Marcus confirmed quietly. Victoria leaned back in her chair, some of the formal tension leaving her shoulders. She observed, with a hint of her usual humor breaking through, that he had a gift for saying exactly enough and not a word more. Did he know that? Marcus's answer referenced Emma, noting that his daughter told him he was frustratingly calm in most situations. She wasn't wrong. A small smile crossed Victoria's face, the first genuine one he'd seen from her that morning. She asked him to tell her about Emma. About Addison, she corrected herself, using his daughter's full name. The invitation surprised Marcus, but he found himself responding naturally. Emma was 11, smart, stubborn, completely certain she knew everything. She played soccer, hated math homework, and had recently decided her entire social status depended on having cleats that didn't embarrass her. Victoria's observation about the trials of middle school came with understanding warmth. Marcus admitted he wasn't ready for it. Emma kept growing up, and he kept wanting to freeze time. "That's what good parents do," Victoria said softly, her voice carrying undertones of something deeper. "Want to protect their children from time itself." Something in her tone made Marcus ask if she had kids. "No." Victoria's answer was simple, but freighted with regret. She'd always thought there would be time for that after she built the company, after she proved herself, after she secured everything. But there was always another milestone, another goal, another reason to wait. And now she was 36, and she'd built this empire, but she came home to an empty penthouse. The only things waiting for her were emails and expensive wine from Napa. The honesty in the statement hung between them, vulnerable in a way that seemed to surprise Victoria herself. She straightened slightly, as if remembering who and where she was, offering an apology for unloading her personal struggles. Marcus's response was gentle, but direct. Friday, she saw him as a person instead of just an employee. Seemed fair that he returned the courtesy. Victoria's expression shifted, something warming in her eyes. She told him he was an interesting man. Most people in his position would be angling for something right now, a promotion, a raise, leverage. But he was just sitting there, being honest. Marcus asked what he would leverage. The fact that she had a rough night? That she was human? He shook his head. That wasn't who he was. No, Victoria agreed quietly. She supposed it wasn't. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but full of things neither of them seemed quite ready to name. Then Victoria's desk phone buzzed, and Patricia's voice came through the speaker, announcing her 10 o'clock. Victoria acknowledged the message, asking Patricia to have them wait just a moment. She turned back to Marcus, noting she should let him get back to work. But before he went, would he have dinner with her sometime this week? There was something else she'd like to discuss. Marcus confirmed he would, aware that crossing this threshold meant something neither of them was fully articulating. Thursday, then, Victoria said. Her calendar was relatively clear. Thursday worked, Marcus agreed, already trying to figure out logistics with Lisa and Emma. Victoria stood, and Marcus did the same. She added one more thing as they moved toward the door. What they'd discussed this morning, about the therapy, about the drinking, she'd appreciate if that stayed between them. Marcus assured her it would, absolutely. She thanked him, then paused with her hand on the door. When they had lunch Thursday, she was going to tell him about a project she was considering, one where his particular talents might be extremely valuable. But she'd wanted to wait until they'd had this conversation first, until she'd made things right from Friday night. Marcus nodded, shook her offered hand, and left the office with more questions than answers. Patricia gave him a knowing smile as he passed, like she'd seen this scene play out before with other employees, though Marcus suspected the context was usually quite different. The elevator ride down felt longer than the ride up, giving him time to process the strangeness of the morning. Victoria Bennett had apologized to him, shared personal struggles, invited him to dinner to discuss some mysterious project. It all felt surreal, like he'd stepped sideways into an alternate version of his life where the CEO of his company treated him as something other than a useful but forgettable resource. Back at his desk, his colleague pounced immediately, demanding to know what happened. Promotion? Firing? Transfer to some secret underground laboratory? Marcus kept it simple. He got thanked for helping with something on Friday. The colleague waited for more details, and when none came, shook his head in frustration. Marcus was killing him with the mystery. Fine, keep his secrets. But if he suddenly showed up with a corner office next week, there would be questions. Marcus returned to his emails, to the comfortable routine of data and patterns and problems he could solve with logic. But part of his mind stayed on that 42nd floor, on the woman who ruled an empire but couldn't make her evenings less lonely, on the unexpected vulnerability she'd shown him, and the trust implicit in that vulnerability. The rest of the week passed in a rhythm that was almost normal, except for the undercurrent of anticipation. Marcus did his work, picked up Emma from school, attended her soccer practice where she dramatically showcased her tragic cleats for his benefit, made dinner, helped with homework, maintained the careful routines that structured their lives. On Tuesday evening, while Emma was absorbed in a video call with her friend Maya, something about a school project that seemed to involve more giggling than actual work, Marcus found himself thinking about Victoria's comment about coming home to an empty penthouse. He looked around his small, cluttered apartment with its mismatched furniture and Emma's art projects covering the fridge, and felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost hurt. He wasn't alone. Every day he came home to evidence of life being lived. Shoes kicked off by the door, backpack dumped on the couch, the lingering smell of whatever breakfast Emma had convinced him to make. The apartment was small, and the furniture was cheap, and the walls were thin enough that he could hear the neighbor's television, but it was full of the things that mattered. Wednesday came and went. Marcus wondered if Victoria had followed through with the therapy appointment, but didn't have any way to know, and certainly wasn't going to ask.
It wasn't his business. He'd offered perspective. She'd taken it. What she did with that perspective was her choice. Thursday morning, Patricia called his extension at 11:30. Ms. Bennett asked her to let him know that dinner would be at 7 at a place called Morrison's on West Adams. It wasn't fancy, Patricia added, almost conspiratorially. Ms. Bennett specifically requested somewhere quiet and casual. Marcus thanked her, already running through his mental checklist. Lisa could stay with Emma. He had a clean shirt that wasn't too wrinkled. The Honda was presentable enough. At 6:45, Marcus pulled up outside Morrison's Steakhouse, a Chicago institution that had been serving the same menu since 1957. Red leather booths, dark wood paneling, the smell of charcoal and aged beef. It was the kind of place where regulars had their own tables, and the waitstaff remembered your order. Victoria was already there, tucked into a corner booth, and Marcus had to recalibrate his mental image of her all over again. She wore dark jeans and a simple sweater, her hair down instead of pinned up. She looked younger like this, or maybe just more accessible. More like someone he might have met at a bookstore than in a boardroom. She smiled when she saw him approaching, a real smile that transformed her features in ways her professional mask never did. She hoped this was okay. She knew it wasn't fancy, but the food was incredible, and nobody from the office ever came here. Marcus slid into the booth across from her, noting the checkered tablecloths and candles stuck in wine bottles. It was perfect. And it was. The casualness of it felt deliberate, like she was showing him a version of herself that didn't perform for audiences. They ordered, ribeye for him, filet for her, and settled into conversation that felt both natural and terrifying. Not the careful professional exchanges they'd perfected over Monday's meeting, but something more honest, more revealing. Victoria asked if she could pose a question, and if she was overstepping, he should tell her. Marcus told her to go ahead. That night at the gala, when he drove her home, was it really just about not wanting to look away, or was there something else? Marcus considered the question carefully, knowing his answer mattered in ways that went beyond simple honesty. At first, yes, it was about not looking away, about seeing someone who needed help. But in the car, when they talked, that became something different. She was vulnerable with him in a way he didn't think she was with many people, and he recognized that vulnerability because he'd lived it. They connected. Victoria's acknowledgement was quiet, but weighted. They did connect. She hadn't been able to stop thinking about that night. Not just the embarrassment of losing control, but the conversation after, the way he saw her as a person instead of a position. Did he know how rare that was? Marcus said he was starting to understand. The food arrived, and they ate while trading stories that felt like testing boundaries, seeing how much truth could be shared without breaking the fragile thing they were building. Victoria told him about growing up in rural Ohio, about her mother who'd believed in her even when no one else did, about the first company she'd built with borrowed money and borrowed courage that had failed spectacularly before she learned enough to succeed. Marcus talked about meeting Sarah in a hospital emergency room after a stupid accident involving a ladder and overconfidence, about how she'd insisted on checking his stitches herself even though she was technically off-duty, about how he'd fallen in love with her efficiency before he'd even noticed her smile. Victoria's voice was soft when she said Sarah sounded wonderful. She was, Marcus confirmed. She was also stubborn and competitive and absolutely terrible at karaoke, but insisted on doing it anyway. The memory made him smile, bittersweet but no longer simply painful. When she died, he'd thought that was it, that he'd had his great love
and nothing would ever come close again. And now? Victoria's question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Marcus set down his fork, forcing himself to meet her gaze directly. Now he was sitting across from someone who made him want to reconsider what was possible. Something shifted in Victoria's expression. Surprise, pleasure, fear, all mixing together in ways that made her suddenly more human than he'd ever seen her. She needed him to understand something, she said, her words coming faster now, like she was afraid if she stopped, she wouldn't be able to start again. She wasn't good at this. Relationships. She was better at acquisitions and contracts, things with clear terms and measurable outcomes. People were, she gestured vaguely, messy, and she was scared that if they tried this, if they crossed this line, she'd mess it up and lose what they already had. Marcus acknowledged the risk. They might. That was the reality of it. Victoria blinked, surprised by his calm. He was very calm about that possibility. Marcus corrected her gently. He wasn't calm. He was terrified. He reached across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, trembling slightly. But he'd learned that being scared doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. Sometimes it means you're doing something important. Someone wise told him that recently. Victoria laughed, but it was shaky, fragile, using her own words against her. Was it working? Maybe, Victoria admitted, but she had conditions. If they were going to do this, really do this, not just see what happens, then they needed rules, boundaries. Marcus told her he was listening. First, work stayed work. They didn't bring personal conflicts into the office, and they didn't let their relationship affect professional decisions. If the project needed something, they treated it objectively. Marcus agreed. Second, Emma came first. Always. If this interfered with his relationship with her in any way, they stopped. No questions, no guilt. Absolutely, Marcus confirmed. Third, Victoria paused, seeming to gather courage. They went slow. She'd been in therapy for barely a week, but Dr. Morrison kept telling her she had a tendency to either avoid intimacy completely or rush into it so fast she didn't process what she was actually feeling. So they went slow. They figured out what this was before they decided what it could be. Marcus nodded, finding unexpected relief in the structure she was creating. Slow sounded good. Slow sounded safe. Safe? Victoria repeated the word like she was testing it. When was the last time either of them felt safe? Marcus's answer was simple and true. He felt safe with her. The admission seemed to surprise them both. Victoria's eyes widened slightly, and then she was smiling, really smiling. Not the practiced corporate version, but something genuine and bright that transformed her entire face. She felt safe with him too, she said quietly. That was what scared her most. They left the restaurant after 10, stepping out into a Chicago spring evening that still carried winter's chill. Victoria had driven herself, a modest Audi she'd apparently owned for years, refusing to upgrade to something flashier despite her wealth. Marcus offered to follow her home to make sure she got there safely. Victoria pointed out she was sober and it was barely 10. She thought she could manage. But she was smiling, and she didn't move toward her car. Although she wouldn't mind talking a little longer, she added. Would he walk with her? They walked without destination, just moving through streets that were still busy with Friday night energy. Young professionals spilling out of bars, couples holding hands, the city alive in the way it only was when weather finally shifted toward warmth. Marcus was hyper-aware of Victoria beside him, the occasional brush of their arms, the way she matched her pace to his, the comfortable silence that settled between their conversations. After they'd walked several blocks, Victoria asked if she could tell him something. Something she hadn't told anyone else. Marcus told her, of course. When her mother was dying, Victoria made her a promise. She told her she'd live a full life. Not just build a successful company, but actually live. Have relationships, take vacations, do things that weren't measured in profit margins and market share. Victoria stopped walking, turning to face him directly. She broke that promise.
For 4 years, she'd hidden behind work and convinced herself that success was enough. But it wasn't.
And she thought part of why she was drinking, why she was so lost that night at the gala, she was drowning in the guilt of breaking her promise to the person who mattered most. Marcus's response was gentle but certain. She could still keep it, the promise. It wasn't too late. That's what Dr. Morrison said, Victoria acknowledged, that every day was a chance to choose differently. She reached for his hand again, holding it between both of hers like something precious. She wanted to choose differently. She wanted to try. Then they'd try, Marcus said simply. They stood there on a Chicago sidewalk while the city moved around them. Two people who'd found each other in the unlikeliest of circumstances, holding on to the possibility of something neither of them fully understood yet. Finally, Victoria stood on her toes and pressed a kiss to his cheek. Brief, soft, carrying the weight of everything they weren't saying yet. "Good night," she whispered. "Good night," Marcus echoed, watching her walk back toward where they'd left their cars until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. The next morning, Emma noticed immediately. She'd developed radar for changes in his emotional state, probably from 3 years of watching him carefully for signs that grief was overwhelming him again. "You're humming," she said over breakfast, looking at him suspiciously. "You never hum." Marcus admitted he was in a good mood. "Because of work? Because of a lot of things," Marcus deflected, knowing this conversation was coming but not quite ready for it yet. Emma's next question was casual, but her eyes were sharp. "Did he see Miss Bennet last night?" "He'd said he was meeting a friend for dinner." Marcus had promised himself he wouldn't lie to Emma, but he also wasn't sure how to explain something he barely understood himself. "He did see her, yes. They had dinner. Just talking, getting to know each other better." "Like a date?" Emma pushed. "Maybe." Marcus acknowledged he didn't know yet. It was complicated. Emma's accusation was delivered with the precision of someone who'd been paying very close attention. He said he'd tell her if anything changed, and Marcus confirmed she was right. He did say that. So he took a breath and gave her what honesty he could offer. Victoria and he were going to spend time together outside of work, get to know each other better, see if there was something more than friendship there. But nothing was decided, nothing was serious yet. He waited until she looked at him before continuing. "And her? She would always be his priority, always. If this made her uncomfortable, if she needed him to slow down or stop, she should tell him." Emma picked at her cereal, not meeting his eyes. Did he like her? Like, really like her? Marcus told her the truth. He thought he might. Yes. And she liked him back? He thought so. Emma's voice got very small when she asked the question that had probably been building since she'd first noticed the change in him. Would Victoria try to be like Mom? Marcus's answer was firm and immediate. No. Nobody could be like Mom. Nobody would ever replace her. Victoria knew that, and he knew that. If this became something real, it would be its own thing. Different. Not better or worse, just different. Emma's follow-up was delivered with devastating simplicity. But what if she didn't like her? Then they'd figure it out together, Marcus promised. But Emma, he paused, making sure she was listening. She'd already met Victoria. She said she liked her. That was before she was maybe going to date her dad, Emma countered, pulling her hand back and crossing her arms. It was different now. Marcus acknowledged that was fair. So what did she need from him? Emma thought about it for a long moment, her face solemn in a way that reminded him painfully of Sarah when she was working through something difficult. Time, Emma finally said. She needed time to get used to the idea, and she needed him to promise that if he started dating Victoria for real, she got to have opinions about it. Marcus assured her she always got to have opinions, even if they were negative opinions, especially then. Her feelings mattered. They always mattered. That seemed to satisfy her, at least temporarily.
They finished breakfast, and Marcus took her shopping for the new cleats, letting her take her time choosing between 3 nearly identical options, while she explained in elaborate detail why the shade of blue mattered more than he could possibly understand. It was normal, comfortable, the kind of Saturday routine that anchored both their lives. But underneath the normalcy, Marcus felt the shift. The future looked different now, held possibilities he'd thought were closed to him permanently. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. That afternoon, while Emma was at Maya's house for a playdate, Marcus's phone rang with Lisa's number. She didn't bother with pleasantries, launching straight into her observation that she'd heard he went on a date with his boss. Marcus sighed, asking how she knew. Addison called her, didn't she? Emma was worried, Lisa confirmed. Also excited, also confused, basically processing a lot of feelings and needed an adult who wasn't him to talk to. Lisa's tone gentled as she asked how he was doing with all this. Marcus paused, trying to articulate something he hadn't fully examined. He was okay. Good, actually. Scared, but good. Sarah would be happy for him, Lisa said with quiet certainty. Marcus wasn't sure about that, but Lisa was. She'd known Sarah probably as well as Marcus did. Sarah wouldn't want him spending the rest of his life alone. She'd want him to find happiness again. Marcus voiced the thought that had been nagging at him. It felt disloyal somehow. Lisa's contradiction was gentle, but firm. It wasn't. Loving someone new didn't diminish what he had with Sarah. It just meant he was still capable of love, still willing to risk his heart. That wasn't betrayal. That was survival. She paused before continuing. But she was going to ask him something, and she wanted him to really think about it before answering. Marcus told her to go ahead. Was he interested in Victoria because of who she was? Or because she was vulnerable with him, and he'd spent 3 years in caretaker mode? Because if it was the latter, that wasn't fair to either of them. The question landed hard because it was one Marcus had been avoiding asking himself. He paused, forcing himself to be honest. It started with a caretaking impulse, but it had become more than that. She challenged him intellectually, made him want to be better, saw parts of him he'd forgotten existed. It wasn't just about taking care of her. Good, Lisa said with audible relief, because she didn't need a savior. She needed a partner. And he needed someone who saw him as more than just Emma's dad or Sarah's widower. Marcus asked when she got so wise. Lisa laughed. She'd always been this wise. He'd just been too busy surviving to notice. She added one final piece of advice before hanging up. Just take it slow. For his sake and Emma's. Don't rush into anything because it felt good to be wanted again. After they disconnected, Marcus sat with Lisa's words, testing them against his feelings. Was he rushing? Was he confusing gratitude and attraction? Or was this real? This pull toward Victoria that felt both terrifying and inevitable? His phone buzzed with a text. Victoria's name appeared with a photo attachment. A book club photo showing her squeezed onto a couch with 5 other women, all of them laughing at something off camera. She looked genuinely happy, relaxed in a way he'd never seen in the office. The accompanying text read, "Proof that I'm building a life outside work. They made me laugh so hard I snorted wine out my nose. Very dignified. Hope your Saturday is going well." Marcus smiled, typing back about taking Emma shopping for cleats, noting she chose based on vibes, which apparently was a legitimate selection criterion now. He added that he was glad she was having fun. Victoria's response came quickly. "Cleats have vibes, obviously." Obviously, Marcus confirmed, feeling something warm settle in his chest. Over the following weeks, they found their rhythm. Professional during work hours, carefully maintaining boundaries that kept their relationship from interfering with the project Victoria had mentioned. An AI-driven analytics platform that could revolutionize how mid-sized companies optimized their operations. Marcus had accepted the position after setting clear boundaries about Emma, and Victoria had respected those completely. But outside the office, they built something else. Coffee on Sunday mornings at a cafe halfway between their apartments. Lunch on Wednesdays when Victoria's schedule allowed. Long phone conversations late at night when Emma was asleep and the world felt small enough to contain just two voices. Week 3 brought the moment Marcus had been both anticipating and dreading. Victoria meeting Emma properly, not as his boss making a courtesy appearance, but as the person he was dating. Emma wore what she called her professional outfit, a dress that was probably too formal for an 11-year-old, but made her feel grown up and confident. She'd insisted on it, despite Marcus's gentle suggestion that she could just wear regular clothes. On the ride up to the 42nd floor, Emma reminded him she knew how to be respectful. She wasn't going to embarrass him. Marcus assured her he wasn't worried about that. He just wanted her to be herself. Patricia greeted them with genuine warmth when they arrived, offering Emma bottled water and complimenting her dress in a way that sounded sincere rather than patronizing. Ms. Bennett was just finishing a call, she said. She'd be with them in just a moment. Emma looked around the executive floor with wide eyes, taking in the art and the views and the general sense of refined power that the space projected. "Dad," she whispered urgently, "this is so cool." Marcus reminded her not to get too impressed. It was still just an office. Emma's counter-argument was delivered with the unarguable logic of an 11-year-old. It was an office with a view of the entire city. The door opened and Victoria emerged. In her presence, Emma went very still, and Marcus saw his boss the way his daughter must be seeing her. Intimidating and impressive in a charcoal suit, dark hair perfect, posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from running a billion-dollar empire. But then Victoria smiled, and the intimidation softened into something more approachable, more human. She greeted Emma by name, expressing genuine pleasure at meeting her. Emma shook her hand with the serious formality of someone trying very hard to make a good impression, thanking Victoria for giving her dad this opportunity. Victoria's response was immediate and gracious. Her dad earned this opportunity all by himself. She was just grateful he accepted it. She glanced at Marcus with an expression that held warmth and maybe pride. Emma was lovely. He must be very proud. Every single day, Marcus confirmed. Victoria led them into her office, and for the next 30 minutes, Marcus watched his daughter and the woman he was falling for engage in a conversation that started with polite questions and quickly evolved into genuine exchange. Emma asked about running a company, and Victoria answered honestly, not talking down, but not oversimplifying either. She talked about challenges and rewards, about making difficult decisions, about learning from failures. Emma's question came with the directness that Marcus had warned Victoria about. Did she ever get scared? Like that she'd make the wrong choice and mess everything up? All the time, Victoria admitted without hesitation. But she'd learned that being scared didn't mean you were doing something wrong. Sometimes it meant you were doing something important. Emma absorbed this, nodding thoughtfully. Then, with the brutal honesty only children could deliver, she asked if Victoria and her dad were friends now. He talked about her differently than he talked about other people he worked with. Marcus felt his face heat, but Victoria handled it with grace. She'd like to think they were friends, yes. Marcus had helped her through a difficult time, and she valued his perspective and his company. Emma's response was delivered with the casualness of someone making an observation rather than a judgment. Good. He needed more friends. He mostly just hung out with her and Aunt Lisa. She paused, then added with devastating honesty. He'd been happier lately since he started working on Victoria's project. She thought it was good for him. Victoria looked at Marcus, and there was something in that look, recognition maybe, or acknowledgement of something neither of them had named yet. She was glad to hear that. She thought working together had been good for both of them. After they left the office, Emma chattered the entire drive home about how cool Miss Bennett was, how amazing the office was, how she definitely wanted to be a CEO when she grew up, because you got to make decisions and help people and have an office with a view. She liked you a lot, Marcus noted carefully. Emma's response came matter-of-factly. She was pretty and smart, and she looked at him the way Maya's mom looked at her dad. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. What did that mean? Emma shrugged with the easy wisdom of childhood observation. She didn't know exactly. Like he was interesting. Like she wanted to keep talking to him even when the conversation was over. She paused before adding quietly, Mom used to look at him like that. The observation sat between them for a moment, heavy with implications that Marcus wasn't ready to fully unpack. Finally, he said carefully, Miss Bennett was his boss. They worked together.
Emma's counter was delivered with impeccable logic. Mom was a nurse and he was a patient. Then they worked together. Then they got married. Marcus tried to find the words to explain that it wasn't the same, that they weren't. But he stopped, realizing he was protesting something Emma hadn't actually accused him of. It was complicated, he finally said. Emma's response was tinged with preteen exasperation. Adults always said that when they didn't want to explain something. She wasn't wrong, but how did you explain to your 11-year-old daughter that you might be developing feelings for someone? That those feelings were terrifying and inappropriate and genuine all at once? That you had no idea what to do about them? You're right, Marcus conceded. It is complicated. But he promised if anything changed, she'd be the first to know. That seemed to satisfy her, and she returned to cataloging all the details of Victoria's office, building a mental image of what success looked like so she could aim for it herself someday. The weeks accumulated into something that felt increasingly like a relationship, even if neither of them had used that word yet. Marcus noticed small changes. Victoria smiled more readily. The tension in her shoulders had eased. She talked about her therapy sessions with a mixture of frustration and gratitude that suggested real work was happening. She'd joined a book club, real women who met in someone's living room and argued about whether endings were satisfying. She was terrible at guessing mysteries, she reported with something like delight. Everyone else figured out the killer by chapter 3. But she was good at seeing business strategy patterns, Marcus had noted. So it evened out. The laughter that followed was becoming more frequent, more natural. Then came the night that changed everything. Marcus's phone rang at midnight on a Tuesday, pulling him from light sleep. Victoria's name on the screen sent adrenaline spiking through his system. He answered immediately, already sitting up. Her voice was shaking when she spoke. She almost drank tonight. She wanted to so badly. Marcus's response was immediate and certain. But she didn't. She called him instead. The silence on the other end was filled with ragged breathing, the sound of someone barely holding themselves together. He was coming over, Marcus told her. Not a question, a statement. He called Lisa, who arrived within 15 minutes, still in pajamas, waving him off with understanding that required no explanation. Emma slept through it all. Victoria's building was quiet at this hour, the night doorman too professional to show surprise at Marcus's arrival. The elevator ride to her penthouse felt eternal. She opened the door before he could knock, still in work clothes, makeup smudged, eyes red. Behind her, he could see the apartment, expensively minimal, everything in its place except for the wine bottle sitting on the kitchen counter. Unopened but present, a testament to a battle barely won. Marcus didn't say anything. He just stepped inside and held out his hand. Victoria took it and started crying in earnest, the kind of crying that came from a place too deep for words. Marcus guided her to the couch and sat with her, not offering platitudes or solutions, just presence, just the gift of not being alone. Hours passed. Victoria talked about the board meeting that had gone until 11, about the client who was threatening to pull out, about the pressure and the loneliness and the voice in her head that insisted just one glass would take the edge off. Marcus listened. He shared his own near misses, the nights after Sarah died, when the urge to drink until he couldn't feel anything had been almost overwhelming. How he'd learned to call Tom Harrison, his electrician friend, and talk about nothing until the urge passed. How it never got easy, but you learned to sit with the wanting. Dawn was breaking through the floor-to-ceiling windows when Victoria finally asked the question that had been building. What if she couldn't do this? What if she was too broken? Marcus's answer was firm and unwavering. She wasn't broken. She was healing. That was different. Victoria's next move was calling Dr. Morrison for an emergency session that morning. Then she did something Marcus hadn't expected. She asked him to come with her to an AA meeting that evening. Not as a participant, not yet, just to observe, to see if it might be something that could help. They went together. Victoria sat in the back and listened to stories that resonated with pieces of her own. Afterward, she didn't commit to anything, but she didn't rule it out either. Progress, Marcus thought. Small, but real. The weekend brought Emma's soccer game, and Marcus watched from the sidelines as Victoria arrived halfway through the first half, still in work clothes because a board meeting had run late. But she came. She promised, and she came. Emma scored in the second half and looked to the sidelines instinctively. When she saw Victoria cheering alongside her dad, her face broke into a smile that Marcus recognized as the beginning of real acceptance. After the game, Emma ran to both of them, breathless and happy. "You really came," she said to Victoria, and the surprise in her voice made Marcus's chest tight. "I promised," Victoria replied simply. "I don't break promises." Something shifted in that moment. Some barrier Emma had been maintaining crumbled just enough to let Victoria a little further in. Sunday brought the three of them to the Chicago Botanic Garden, Emma running ahead to examine flowers that caught her attention, while Marcus and Victoria walked at a slower pace, hands occasionally brushing but not quite holding. The words came out of Victoria suddenly, like they'd been building pressure and finally burst free. She loved him. She knew they'd said they'd go slow, and maybe this was too fast, but she loved him and needed him to know. Marcus stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Emma was still ahead, absorbed in her own world. Around them, other families and couples moved through the gardens, everyone existing in their own small universes of connection. He loved her too, Marcus said, and saying it felt like permission to acknowledge what had been building for weeks. He thought he'd loved her since that first conversation in the car, when she was honest enough to admit she was struggling and brave enough to accept help. Victoria observed that was a very specific moment to fall in love. Marcus noted he was a very specific person. She laughed and kissed him there in the middle of the path, not caring who saw. And Marcus kissed her back, feeling something settle deep in his chest that he recognized as hope. Emma caught the kiss, of course. She came running back, face flushed from sun and exertion, looking between them with an expression that cycled rapidly through surprise, calculation, and finally something that might have been satisfaction. "You guys are being gross," she announced with the authority of an 11-year-old social arbiter. Victoria agreed solemnly. "Extremely gross." Emma's face broke into a grin. Good. That meant they were happy. That evening, after they'd dropped Victoria at her apartment and driven home, Emma was quiet in the back seat in a way that suggested significant mental processing was occurring. Marcus gave her space, making dinner and setting the table while she sat at the kitchen counter, ostensibly doing homework, but clearly working through something more important than math problems. Finally, as they were eating, she asked if she could pose a question. "Always," Marcus confirmed. Was Victoria going to move in with them? The question caught him completely off guard. They hadn't talked about that. Why was she asking? Because Victoria was at their place a lot, Emma explained with patient logic, and he was at her place sometimes, and it seemed like maybe that was where this was going. She pushed pasta around her plate before looking up with eyes that were too old for 11. She wasn't saying she didn't want it. She was just asking. Marcus set down his fork, giving her his complete attention. Would she be okay with it if Victoria did move in?
Emma's answer was honest and raw. She didn't know. Maybe. She looked up and her eyes held the weight of everything she'd been carrying. She liked Victoria. She really did. Victoria was nice to her and made her dad smile and didn't try to pretend she was mom. But it was scary having someone else in their space, changing how things worked. Marcus acknowledged that was fair and honest. He thanked her for telling him. So was he going to do it? Ask Victoria to move in? Not yet, Marcus assured her. They were taking things slow, remember? But Emma, he waited until she met his eyes. If and when they got to that point, she'd be part of the decision. Her home was her safe place. He wouldn't change that without making sure she was comfortable. Emma nodded, seeming satisfied for now, and returned to her dinner with the matter apparently settled in her mind, at least temporarily. But Marcus sat with the question long after Emma had gone to bed, examining it from every angle, weighing implications and possibilities, and the simple fact that Victoria had started appearing in his vision of the future in ways that felt both inevitable and impossibly fragile. The following Friday, Victoria texted during Emma's soccer practice with a simple question. Would they want to look at houses this weekend? She'd been researching neighborhoods, school districts, places where a family could actually breathe. Marcus stared at the message for a full minute, aware that responding meant crossing another threshold they couldn't uncross. Emma was on the field, completely absorbed in defending against Maya's aggressive offense, oblivious to the fact that her father was contemplating upending their entire living situation. He typed back, "Let me talk to Emma first. Make sure she's really ready." Victoria's response came immediately. "Of course. Take whatever time you need."
No pressure. But there was pressure, Marcus thought. The good kind. The kind that came from building something real instead of just surviving day to day. That night, after Emma had showered and changed into pajamas covered in cartoon cats, Marcus sat her down for what he mentally classified as the conversation part 2. He'd been thinking about what she'd asked earlier, he began, about Victoria maybe moving in, and he wanted to know if she'd been serious or just wondering. Emma's face cycled through several expressions before settling on something like cautious hope. She'd been serious, sort of. She was still scared, but maybe in a good way? Like when you're about to go down a big slide and you know it might be scary, but also fun? Marcus absorbed this unexpected metaphor. So she'd be okay with them looking at houses? The three of them together? Emma's condition came immediately. Only if she got to help decide. And only if they could bring all of Mom's stuff. Pictures, the blanket she made, the elephant, everything. Marcus promised they'd bring everything. Rachel would always be part of their family. Victoria understood that. Then, okay, Emma said with a decisiveness that reminded Marcus painfully of Sarah making medical decisions. They could look. Saturday morning found them in Victoria's Audi. Marcus had suggested they take his Honda, but Victoria gently noted that her car had better air conditioning, and Emma would be more comfortable in the back seat. The real estate agent, a cheerful woman named Barbara who specialized in family homes, met them at the first property with a folder of listings and a practiced smile. The first house was too modern, all sharp angles and floor-to-ceiling windows that made Emma uncomfortable. She whispered to Marcus that it felt like living in a museum where you couldn't touch anything. The second was too old, with creaking floors and a basement that smelled like mildew. Emma took one look at the ancient furnace and declared it was definitely haunted. The third was too close to the highway, the constant traffic noise making conversation difficult even inside. Victoria diplomatically suggested they move on. By the time they pulled up to the fourth house, Emma was slumped in the back seat, convinced they'd never find anything. Then Barbara unlocked the door to a craftsman-style home in a quiet neighborhood 10 minutes from Emma's school, and everything changed. Hardwood floors gleamed in the afternoon light streaming through original windows. Built-in bookshelves lined the living room walls, begging to be filled. The kitchen was spacious without being cavernous, opening onto a deck that overlooked a small yard with established gardens and a maple tree perfect for reading under.
Emma walked through the space with growing excitement, her earlier skepticism evaporating. Upstairs, there were 4 bedrooms. The largest had an ensuite bathroom and a reading nook by the window. The second bedroom faced the backyard, with morning light that would be perfect for waking up. The third could be an office. The fourth could be for guests, or whatever the future required. Emma stood in what would be her room, slowly turning to take in the space, the light, the view of the maple tree. Her voice was quiet but certain when she spoke. "This one. This is the one." Barbara smiled knowingly, probably recognizing the moment when a house became inevitable. Victoria caught Marcus's eye across the empty room, and he saw his own thoughts reflected back. This could work. This could be home. They made an offer that evening, slightly over asking because neither Marcus nor Victoria wanted to risk losing what felt like exactly the right place. 3 days later, the offer was accepted. 4 weeks after that, they closed on the house and began the strange, intimate process of merging 3 separate lives into one shared space. Marcus's possessions fit into a dozen boxes. His furniture was functional but forgettable, the kind of things you bought because they were cheap and practical, rather than because you loved them. Victoria arrived with pieces that belonged in home design magazines, a leather couch that actually looked comfortable, a dining table that could seat 8, bedroom furniture that transformed the master suite into something adults would inhabit rather than just sleep in. But she also brought boxes she'd been storing for years. Her mother's china, carefully wrapped and unused since the funeral. Photo albums from childhood, from college, from the early days of building her first company. Books her mother had loved, their spines cracked from repeated readings. And she insisted on something that made Marcus love her even more. They spent an entire afternoon arranging photos of Rachel throughout the house. In the living room, a beautiful candid shot of Sarah laughing at something off camera. In Emma's room, a whole wall dedicated to memories. Rachel reading bedtime stories. Rachel at Emma's kindergarten graduation. Rachel and Marcus on their wedding day, looking impossibly young and optimistic. Emma watched Victoria hang each frame with careful attention to placement and lighting, and Marcus saw something shift in his daughter's expression, a release of tension she'd been carrying since this whole thing started. "Thank you," Emma said quietly, "for not making us hide her." Victoria's response was immediate and fierce. "She's part of this family. She'll always be part of our story. We don't erase people we love to make room for new love. We make room for all of it." The first weeks in the new house were an exercise in adjustment. They argued about dishwasher loading philosophy. Marcus believed in maximizing space efficiency, Victoria in ensuring water could reach all surfaces. Emma thought they were both overthinking dishes. They discovered Victoria kept the house significantly cooler than Marcus and Emma were accustomed to, leading to negotiations about thermostat settings that felt disproportionately important. Emma had moments of jealousy when Marcus and Victoria announced date nights, moments when she'd go quiet and withdrawn until Victoria or Marcus noticed and gently drew her back out. They established new routines, family dinners at the table every night, no phones allowed. Sunday morning pancakes that Victoria learned to make from a recipe Marcus's mother had passed down. Saturday afternoons, where Emma got to choose the activity, whether that was soccer practice, or the science museum, or just reading in the backyard. Marcus still wore his wedding ring on a chain around his neck. Victoria had noticed it that first night, but never asked him to remove it. Emma had explained once, in a moment of unusual openness, that the ring meant Dad still loved Mom, even though he loved Victoria too. And Victoria had simply nodded and said that made perfect sense. 6 months after moving in, on a Saturday morning when autumn was just beginning to assert itself against summer's last stand, Victoria found Marcus in the backyard, standing by a small garden bed that looked like it had been loved once and could be loved again. She approached quietly, 2 cups of coffee in hand, and stood beside him for a moment before speaking. She'd been thinking about something, about stepping back from the CEO role. Marcus turned to look at her, genuinely surprised. "What?" "Not entirely,"
Victoria clarified. Not right away, but maybe transitioning to chair of the board, bringing in someone else to handle day-to-day operations. She'd been doing this for 15 years, building and running and pushing and growing, and she was tired. Not burned out exactly, but ready for something different. Marcus asked what she'd do instead. Victoria's answer came with a lightness he'd rarely heard. She didn't know yet. That was the exciting part. Maybe she'd teach or mentor young entrepreneurs, or just be home more, be present for Emma's school events, for their life together. She'd spent so long defining herself by her work, and therapy had helped her realize she was more than her company. She was allowed to want other things. The question of timing came naturally. When would this happen? Victoria had a plan: announce it next month, transition over 6 months. That would give her time to find the right successor, to make sure the company was in good hands. Janet Matthews, who'd been VP of Operations for 3 years, was the obvious choice. Smart, steady, understood the culture. Marcus told her he thought it was brave. Probably the healthiest decision she could make, and he was incredibly proud of her. Victoria's question came with vulnerability that still surprised him, even after months together. He didn't think she was giving up. Marcus's answer was firm. He thought she was choosing what mattered most. That wasn't giving up. That was wisdom. Victoria made the announcement the following month at a board meeting. The news rippled through Bennett Industries like a controlled detonation. Shock, speculation, inevitable concerns about the company's future under new leadership. But Victoria handled it with characteristic competence, outlining a succession plan that was thorough and sensible, making clear she wasn't abandoning the company, but evolving her relationship with it. The AI analytics platform that Marcus had been leading launched to widespread acclaim, despite initial competitor threats. The technical excellence of his team's work, the careful attention to user experience, the robust security protocols, all of it combined to create a product that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. Early adoption numbers were remarkable. Revenue in the first quarter surpassed the entire year's conservative estimates. Marcus was promoted to Vice President of Innovation, a role that finally separated his reporting structure from Victoria completely. No more ethics reviews, no more careful navigation of conflict of interest protocols. Just clean professional boundaries and personal relationship properly segregated. His old colleague from the gala, the one who'd been so insistent about the open bar, sought him out to offer congratulations that seemed genuine despite the earlier skepticism. Turned out, Marcus had earned it after all. Turned out, good work actually mattered more than office politics. Tom Harrison came to the product launch party, looking proud in a way that made Marcus's throat tight. The electrician clapped him on the shoulder and delivered wisdom in his typically economical style. He told Marcus that jealousy was just a compliment in disguise. People were jealous because Marcus deserved the success. But success at work felt secondary to the success Marcus was more invested in. Building a family that actually functioned. Creating a home where Emma felt safe, and Victoria felt welcomed, and everyone had room to be themselves. Emma had been doing well, thriving even. Her grades were excellent, her soccer team was winning, she'd made new friends in the neighborhood. But Marcus noticed something else, too. She'd gotten quieter about Rachel, stopped bringing her up as frequently, stopped requesting bedtime stories about Mom the way she used to. He told himself it was natural, that she was getting older, that memories faded, and that was just how grief worked. But something about it bothered him in ways he couldn't articulate. Then came the Thursday evening that changed everything. Marcus got home from work to find the house silent. Victoria was at a late meeting. He expected to find Emma in her room doing homework or on the phone with Maya planning their weekend sleepover. Instead, he found her at the kitchen table, staring at a blank piece of paper with red-rimmed eyes. When she looked up at him, her face crumpled. She couldn't remember Mom's voice anymore. She'd been trying all afternoon, trying to hear it in her head the way she used to be able to, but it was gone. Just gone. Marcus felt his own chest constrict.
old grief mixing with new helplessness. He sat down beside her, not knowing what to say because he couldn't fix this, couldn't give her back what time had taken. Emma's fear came tumbling out in words that had probably been building for months. What else was she going to forget? What if she forgot everything? What if loving Victoria meant she was erasing Mom? What if being happy in this new house, in this new family, was a betrayal of everything that came before? And underneath all of that, the question that broke Marcus completely: what if Victoria left like Mom did? What if Emma opened her heart all the way, and then Victoria died too, and she had to go through this pain all over again? Marcus didn't have answers. He just pulled Emma close and let her cry, his own tears falling silently into her hair. When Victoria came home an hour later, she found them still at the kitchen table, Emma exhausted and quiet, Marcus looking hollowed out. She took in the scene with quick assessment and simply asked what they needed. Emma's response was directed at Victoria with brutal honesty. She was scared. Scared of forgetting Mom. Scared of loving Victoria too much. Scared of everything changing. Victoria pulled out a chair and sat down, making herself part of the circle rather than standing above it. Her voice was gentle but direct when she spoke. She was scared too. Scared that Emma would never fully accept her. Scared that she'd mess this up. Scared that she wasn't enough. But being scared was okay. Being scared meant they cared enough about each other to worry about losing what they had. Marcus found his voice finally, found the words he'd been searching for all evening. Emma's heart didn't have limited space, he told her. Loving Victoria didn't mean less room for Mom or for him. Love didn't work like division, it worked like multiplication. The more you gave, the more you had. Emma looked between them, wanting to believe but not quite there yet. Victoria's next question was practical rather than philosophical. What about Mom did Emma miss most right now? Her voice, Emma whispered. She missed hearing her voice. Victoria turned to Marcus. Did he have recordings? Old voicemails, videos, anything with Rachel's voice? Marcus felt something click in his brain. His old phone. The one he'd been too sentimental to throw away even after transferring everything to a new device. He'd kept it in his desk drawer, couldn't quite bring himself to erase it completely. He retrieved it, plugged it in, waited for it to power up. And then he opened the voicemail folder he hadn't accessed in 3 years. There were dozens. Rachel calling about picking up milk, reminding him about Emma's dentist appointment, laughing about something Emma had done at school. Rachel singing lullabies when Emma was a baby and wouldn't sleep. Rachel's voice exactly as it had been, warm and slightly off-key and completely, perfectly her. Emma listened to each one twice, then asked if they could save them, keep them somewhere safe so she'd never lose them. Marcus spent the next hour transferring every recording to a secure drive, making multiple backups, creating a folder Emma could access whenever she needed. Victoria sat with Emma through the whole process, not trying to fix anything, just being present. When it was done, Emma asked Victoria a question that felt like a test and an invitation all at once. Would she teach Emma about business stuff? Like real stuff, not just the sanitized version for kids? Victoria's acceptance was immediate. Absolutely. And would Emma teach her how to be good at this family thing? Because she was still learning and could use the help. Emma's response was simple. Deal. Something fundamental shifted in that moment. Not a complete resolution. Grief didn't work like that. Fear didn't evaporate just because you acknowledged it. But an understanding had been reached. They were in this together, all three of them, building something new without erasing what came before. The weeks that followed brought a peace Marcus hadn't realized he'd been missing. Emma started calling Victoria by her first name instead of Miss Bennet, a small change that signaled larger acceptance. Victoria learned Emma's schedule by heart,
never missing a game or recital or parent-teacher conference. Marcus watched them develop inside jokes he wasn't part of, watched Victoria help Emma with math homework using business analogies that actually worked, watched his daughter bloom under attention from someone who chose to love her rather than being obligated to. 1 year and 2 weeks after the gala where everything started, Marcus made a decision. He consulted Emma first, taking her to their favorite diner for pancakes and letting her order chocolate chip when she usually went for blueberry. She knew something was up immediately. He wanted to ask Victoria to marry them, he said. Not just marry him, but join their family officially. But only if Emma was okay with it.
Emma's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, consideration, something that looked like relief, and finally a grin that reminded him painfully of Sarah. "About time," she declared. She'd been wondering when he'd get around to it. Marcus asked if she was sure, really sure. Emma's answer was delivered with the confidence of someone who'd thought this through already. Victoria made him happy, made them both happy. She didn't try to be mom, and she didn't make them forget mom. She was just Victoria, and that was exactly who they needed. So yes, she was sure. Finally. The ring took Marcus 2 weeks to find. He knew Victoria preferred sapphires to diamonds. She'd mentioned it once during a conversation about the engagement ring her mother had worn, a small sapphire surrounded by her grandfather's hands. Marcus searched jewelry stores across Chicago until he found one that felt right. Not ostentatious, not trying too hard, just beautiful and genuine and suited to the woman he was asking to build a life with. He chose an autumn evening when the maple tree in the backyard was at peak color, leaves falling like golden rain. They'd finished family dinner, Emma had helped clean up, and then she'd made an elaborate show of needing to do homework upstairs, leaving Marcus and Victoria alone on the deck. Victoria was watching the sunset, completely oblivious to what was coming. Marcus had practiced what he wanted to say, but when the moment arrived, most of it evaporated, leaving only truth. It had been a year since that night at the gala, he began. Every single day since then had been better because she was in it. Victoria turned to look at him, starting to smile at what she probably thought was just affection talking. He knew they'd said slow, Marcus continued. But slow didn't mean scared anymore. Slow meant careful, intentional, building the right foundation. And he thought their foundation was solid. He pulled out the small box, watching her eyes widen with recognition and understanding. "Marry me," he said simply. "Make this family official." Victoria's hands went to her mouth, and tears were streaming down her face, and she was nodding before she could speak. Yes, tumbling out repeatedly between attempts to catch her breath. Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger, and she pulled him into a kiss that tasted like salt and joy and all the accumulated hope they'd been building together. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Victoria added something he hadn't expected. She wanted to take his last name. Bennett had been about building an empire. Hayes was about building a home. The sound of a window opening made them both look up. Emma was leaning out of her bedroom window, grinning. Finally, she yelled down. She'd been watching the whole time, obviously, and could she please be chief family officer instead of just a bridesmaid? The wedding, when it happened 6 months later in late spring, was exactly what they'd wanted. Small, intimate, held in their backyard with 40 close friends and family bearing witness. String lights woven through the maple tree, simple flowers from local gardens, a ceremony that felt more like a celebration than a formality. Lisa cried through her reading from a Mary Oliver poem about love and wildness. Tom Harrison gave a toast about good men still winning that made several people reach for tissues. Patricia, who'd become a genuine friend to Victoria over the years of working together, told stories about watching Victoria transform from the Ice Queen into someone capable of real vulnerability. But the moment that mattered most
came during the vows. Marcus stood with Victoria and Emma between them, Emma holding both their hands, officially part of the union being formed.
He'd written his vows longhand, revised them a dozen times, but when he spoke, they came from somewhere deeper than preparation. He was marrying both of them today, he said. Victoria, she'd taught him that grief didn't mean closing his heart. She'd shown him that loving again was courage, not betrayal. Emma, thank you for being brave enough to let someone new into their family. She didn't have to do that, but she did, and it made him prouder than anything else in his life. They were a family now, officially, and families faced the world together. Victoria's vows were just as deliberate, just as meaningful. To Emma, she wasn't replacing her mother. Nobody could do that. But she promised to honor Rachel's memory, to support Emma's dreams, to love her as fiercely as any parent could. To Marcus, thank you for seeing her when everyone else looked away. Thank you for believing she could be more than her worst moment. Thank you for teaching her that love was worth the risk of pain. And then, looking up as if addressing someone beyond the gathered witnesses, Mom, I'm finally living a full life. Thank you for believing I could. Emma surprised everyone with a short speech she prepared without telling anyone. Mom would want Dad to be happy, she said with a composure that belied her 12 years. And Tori made him happy, made them both happy. So this was good. This was really good. Then, voice wavering slightly, Mom, if you're listening, thank you for Dad. I'll take care of both of them. There wasn't a dry eye under the maple tree. The officiant pronounced them married, husband and wife, and family. And Marcus kissed Victoria while Emma cheered and their friends applauded, and the late afternoon sun made everything look like it had been touched with gold. The reception was simple and perfect. Victoria danced with Marcus to a slow song neither of them could remember later. Then she danced with Emma to something upbeat that had them both laughing. Then all three of them together, which looked awkward and felt perfect. The photographer captured it all, the formal portraits, the candid moments, the laughter and tears and quiet exchanges. But she also captured the photo they'd specifically requested. All three of them together, smiling, with Rachel's portrait on the table beside them. Not erased, not forgotten, honored as part of the story that had brought them here. As evening settled and guests began to depart with hugs and well wishes, the three of them stood together in their yard, looking at the house that had become home, at the family they'd built by choice and commitment and daily acts of love. Well, Mrs. Hayes, Marcus said, still getting used to the sound of it. Victoria corrected him with a grin. She'd decided on Bennett Hayes professionally, Hayes personally. Best of both worlds. Emma inserted herself between them, confident in her place. So what now? Now we live happily, Marcus said. One day at a time, building something good, making choices that matter. Emma looked between them. But still pretty perfect, right? Pretty perfect, Victoria agreed, and Marcus nodded. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning when the seasons had turned again and winter was just beginning to lose its grip, Victoria's doorbell rang with an unexpected delivery. An old friend of her mother's had been cleaning out storage and found boxes that belonged to Victoria, things her mother had kept, things that had been packed away after the funeral and forgotten. Inside was her mother's journal, the one she'd kept during her final months. Victoria had known about it, but had never been able to bring herself to read it, too afraid of what pain it might contain. Marcus and Emma were in the kitchen when Victoria opened it, hands shaking slightly. She read through entries about treatment plans and bucket lists and small mercies, and then she reached the last entry, dated 2 days before her mother died. The words were shaky, but clear. I hope Victoria finds someone who sees her heart, not just her success. She deserves to be loved for who she is, not what she's built. I think she will. My daughter is stronger than she knows, and braver than she believes.
Victoria read it aloud through tears, and Marcus wrapped his arms around her from behind, while Emma pressed close to her side. "She would have been proud of you," Marcus murmured into her hair. Emma's addition was characteristically direct. "She'd be proud of all of us." They spent the rest of the morning in the garden Victoria and Emma had planted together the previous spring. Tomatoes and herbs and flowers that had survived the winter and were just beginning to show signs of new growth. Emma provided running commentary on which plants looked promising and which might need intervention. Victoria took notes, despite having no gardening expertise whatsoever. Marcus watched them laugh over optimistic predictions about tomato yields and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized as complete contentment. Later, after Emma had gone to Maya's house for the afternoon and the house was quiet, Marcus found himself in the study, looking at the photo from the wedding. 3 people building a family from the fragments of loss. 2 women who'd loved him in different ways, different times, both essential to who he'd become. A daughter learning that hearts were more resilient than anyone gave them credit for. He thought about patterns and how they shifted when you refused to look away. Thought about that night at the gala when he'd made a choice that seemed small at the time, but had cascaded into everything that came after. Thought about Victoria standing alone by a marble column while 500 people pretended not to see her struggling. Thought about how one act of basic human decency had opened a door neither of them knew they were looking for. 3 years ago, he'd lost Rachel and thought love was finished for him. 1 year ago, he'd chosen not to look away when everyone else did. Today, he had a wife who challenged him to be better, a daughter who was learning to hold space for complicated emotions, a home that felt like sanctuary rather than just shelter. The patterns once disrupted had indeed never returned to their original form. But sometimes, Marcus had learned, they shifted into something even better than what came before. Not better in a way that diminished what was lost. Sarah would always be part of his story, always be Emma's mother, always matter. But better in the sense that life had proven itself capable of surprise, of second chances, of building new joy without erasing old pain. Victoria found him in the study, reading glasses perched on her nose, looking both professional and domestic in a way that made his heart skip. She had paperwork from the board meeting, meted his thoughts on a mentorship program she was developing. But first, she paused, studying his expression with the attention she brought to everything that mattered. Was he okay? Marcus pulled her close, breathing in the scent that had become as familiar as home. He was better than okay. He was grateful. For her, for Emma, for the life they were building together, for the courage it took to love again after loss, for her willingness to be seen and his refusal to look away. Victoria kissed him softly, a promise and a thank you all at once. And in that moment, surrounded by the evidence of lives well lived and love freely given, Marcus Hayes knew something with absolute certainty. Sometimes, the bravest thing you could do was refuse to look away when everyone else did. Because in that moment of seeing and being seen, everything could change. The world didn't come with guarantees. Tomorrow could bring challenges neither of them had anticipated. But they'd face it together, him and Victoria and Emma, 3 people who'd learned that family wasn't just about blood or tradition or the way things had always been. It was about choosing each other, day after day, in the small moments and the large ones, through fear and hope and everything in between. He'd started this journey as a man surviving, putting one foot in front of the other because he had no other choice. He'd arrived somewhere he never expected, not just surviving, but actually living, building rather than enduring, opening his heart despite every rational reason to keep it closed. The sunset through the study window painted everything in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in the neighborhood, Emma was probably charming Maya's parents with her elaborate theories about which soccer formations were superior. Somewhere in the city, people were making choices that would change their lives in ways they couldn't yet see. And here, in this house, on this street, in this life they'd built together, Marcus Hayes held his wife close and thought about patterns and disruption and the beautiful chaos of choosing love over fear. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.